was still a kid on the moon, watching those lives and learning. Who am I really? 26 and still searching. Oh, wait to know, but this other me is again living. I'm blessed, but I'm not really aware of it. We're all blessed enough.
Bien, bonjour à tous et bienvenue.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this second day of the Normandy Peace Forum on the grounds of the Abbaye aux Dames. It's not raining yet, which is a good thing. Welcome to you as well, Frédéric Bodos, founder of the NGO Projet Imagine. Thank you. It's a privilege to collaborate with him on this forum. He's the Vice President of the Normandy Region in charge of European and international affairs, as well as for the promotion of Normandy. Please give a warm round of applause to François-Xavier Priolo. As you know, this forum is happening here on the grounds of the Abbaye aux Dames, but it's also happening online on YouTube, Facebook. Please use and use again our hashtag NPP2022. Right behind me you can see the Whispering Wall sculpture, which is the symbol of our title, Down with the Walls. This sculpture actually speaks, so when you leave this plenary, you can go take a look. This forum is happening over 2 days, and the least we can say is that we've had very rich debates yesterday. Let's go back to this series of events yesterday.
Très belle journée hier.
So it was a very good day yesterday. We talked about the war in Ukraine. It was front and center among international security topics recently. It very much affects our daily life. How does France tackle this issue? How does it prepare for this new era? Well, for this second day, the Minister of the Armed Forces honors us with his presence. Please give a warm round of applause to Sébastien Lecornu.
Dis un bonjour.
Good morning, everyone. I wish to congratulate the organizers of these 2 days, starting with the one that's not present, Hervé Morin, President of the region. That reminds us that the pandemic is not over. But I send him my regard. François-Xavier Priolo, my accomplice, parliamentarian from the Eure department. Thank you to François-Xavier for all the energy that you inject into this forum. It's something that he's worked on for years within the regional council. It's an indispensable system. We Normans have a debt to pay to peace. There are many initiatives for peace in Paris, in Europe, in France, but clearly the 50,000 civilians that fell here in Normandy, almost 130,000 military men that fell as well on these beaches of Normandy, do pass on to us a glorious and also heavy heritage. There's no peace without remembrance, and this Peace Forum does invite us to project us onto the future, but it's also an opportunity to do an act of remembrance. I don't want to read a speech that was written for you. In the car on my way here, I just jotted down a few reflections. I've been a Minister of Armed Forces for 5 months. I'm a Normand, just like you. I have political convictions, you know them. I was thinking that in this moment, to reflect on your invitation, how is France preparing for this new era? We French need to give a clear answer to this question. It's what the President will do as well. Let's go back to the title, Down with the Wolves. It's not an easy title. It's almost a Pavlovian title. When you're afraid, you want to protect yourself. And when we protect ourselves, we try to protect ourselves from someone, from the other. It's not intuitive at all to take the wall down or to step out of the comfort zone and embrace insecurity. You've shown that yesterday throughout the different conferences. My first reflection here is this. We must think again about the role played by law. Law is what allows us rather to avoid escalation wars. That's the heritage of 1945. That's the universality, the universal aspect of certain values. That's the primal aspect of law, of international law. Let's not confuse wars and order. We have a world order emanating from the Second World War. This week, with the General Assembly speeches, we were reminded of the importance of law. So, law recognizes borders. Borders frame a sovereignty, and that's a way of solving the issue of the power dynamics between the weak and the strong. And the President of the Republic reminded it this week. This aggression in Ukraine done by the Federation of Russia is questioned, is a deep scar in international law. This border between Ukraine and Russia, of course, concerns these two countries, but it also concerns all the countries in the world, because that's the the recognition of the value of these borders when we're in Africa, in the Middle East, when countries go through tough economic times or tough social times. Their only their only wealth left is their border. That's why borders are sanctified by international law, and that's why all the countries in the world have signed the UN Charter and take part in the UN works. So we can't claim down with the walls without questioning the place given to law and international law specifically, because it is the instrument that prevents the building of these useless walls. Second reflection for us today is the topic of our alliances. That's the other heritage of 1945. Alliances, at the end of the day, just like in our daily life, are just like the motto. This should take us to lead two reflections on the different types of alliances. We have our Atlantic alliance, NATO. We've heard a lot about NATO, sometimes ironic reflections. The minister here present had a seat at the Parliamentary Assembly of NATO. France has a key role to play, and a singular role to play in the Atlantic Alliance. The president used to say that NATO was in a state of cerebral death, and it was partly true, because all the decisions taken after the 1990s led us to believe that conventional and nuclear threats were a thing of the past. So we must question the place of France and of the EU within the Atlantic Alliance. That's key. And we can tell that wars have moved, if we go back to the wars, with the coming membership of Sweden and Finland to NATO. That being said, the perimeter of this alliance is never a set subject. And that was the ambition of de Gaulle, who did not want the alliance's ambition to go too far. On the topic of the EU now, I think we should be proud that this construction held. No one could actually claim that the EU would break, would implode, if imposed too many restrictions, too many insecurities. Because our collective response in the face of war was unanimous. We have a program of support to Ukraine, and we will carry on supporting them. We mustn't stop here with the provision of weapons and support. We must continue helping them in terms of training, which is why the topic of alliances is a key element when we think about wars. That's how we can tackle this Down with the Walls title. Based on these alliances, we can build real or fictitious walls that can recreate conditions of profound insecurity. Third reflection, we shouldn't lecture others about walls if we do not question our own failures within Western democracies, economic and social issues. We've seen that with Yellow Jackets, individualism, and the role of the individual that sometimes dominates the collective mind, the rise of abstention. All these new walls are a major challenge for our model, our democratic model. Let's not fool ourselves. In Moscow and probably in other major capitals of the great powers, there's a political gamble on the field of values, which is to say that our liberal democracies are decadent. Our liberal democracies are a vector of weaknesses. We should look in the mirror and understand that our own walls do not help us being more resilient. Our own weaknesses prevent us from defending the model that we support. That's the Republican model. We should look in the mirror, not be afraid of carrying out self-criticism and finding the noble element of domestic policy that we can put forward in this debate. Finally, we should not lecture others, since we do have our own walls erected within French society. We were saying that earlier with the former president of IHEDN. The contribution to peace of a society cannot rest only on armies or diplomats. That's a great lesson we can draw from the war in Ukraine, a lesson we can draw from the Ukrainian people. There is no average or high intensity without the resilience of an entire social entity. That's one of the key elements here. And that takes us back to the universal national service. The government will have to pronounce itself on this topic. School has a role to play to prepare the society for this. We must also tackle the topic of the reserve. If you are part of the reserve, it's not enough. We should give the ability and access to all citizens so that they could be part of the reserve. We can go through terrorism, a pandemic, and a war at the same time. It's a huge thing to take on. So we must prepare people better for this. We must prepare the nation for this. That takes us as well to climate change. Our overseas territories are very hit, are very vulnerable, but even metropolitan France is very exposed to these deregulation. Security threats are multifaceted today, which is why we must better prepare our society. As Minister of the Armed Forces, I would be incomplete if I didn't reassert that wars are led without the walls. If we were just to take down some walls to have peace, it would be a liar to said to public opinion, because we are now entering a new era of conflicts. This war in Ukraine is led because we are slowly working around the nuclear doctrine. President Putin uses its nuclear backbone to lead a conventional aggression war. We must think collectively on this, because France is a nuclear power, is a permanent member of the Security Council. So, if we talk about peace, if we talk about defense, of preparing for the future, we must rethink not just the nuclear messaging, because the President of the Republic, ever since de Gaulle, during each mandate, gives a clear vision and a framework of use of the nuclear weapon, and President Macron has done that. However, I think it is high time we explain again to our citizens why de Gaulle wished France to be a nuclear power. What are the pillars of this nuclear power? What do we have? Two components: airborne and seaborne. Not so that we enter in active nuclear messaging. I was very shocked by the debate on high-intensity wars. Will France be able to hold 2 weeks, 3 weeks in a nuclear confrontation? It doesn't make sense. There's a complete defense system around this. And it's not just about this today. This high intensity can be deployed beneath the nuclear umbrella. And that's the lesson we can draw from Ukraine, even for France. That's also the topic of so-called hybrid threats. That's the case of cyber threats. That's the information war led by some competitors. That's the energy blackmail also being done by some actors, or blackmail using agricultural goods. These elements, civil in origin, are deployed and hijacked with a military end. That is what's happening beneath the nuclear messaging, and we are vulnerable to this. Democracies will always be more vulnerable than a certain amount of countries, especially as far as the information war, and we must prepare for this. About a month ago, there was a hospital in the Parisian region that was hit by a cyber attack, a very serious one. And this hospital really struggled to carry out its mission. It made some headlines in the news. If a terrorist entered the hospital with a Kalashnikov, we would have had exceptional programs on the news to talk about this attack. And this poses an interesting question. If tomorrow some cyber attackers are able to shut down several French hospitals, there will be deaths and there will be important consequences. This is a new type of threat that we must look into. It's as important as the nuclear messaging de Gaulle was working on when he wanted to give France a nuclear weapon. I'm not comparing both of these things. I'm just saying that technologies inevitably bring new threats, and these threats must be answered in a new way. And that's beyond the walls. Blackmail using agricultural goods, energy, cyber threats. All of these are new type of wars that we do not treat collectively. It goes the same for terrorism. As Normans, I would ask us to make sure that Ukraine does not make us blind to the situation in Africa. When some people are ready to criticize, to caricature our work with Barkhane, with the French armed forces, what the Europeans did with Takuba force in Africa, I'm very worried to think that the terrorist threat cannot be added to the eastern flank of Europe, thinking that what's happening right now in the Sahel region can have no impact on the safety of Europeans. Those who say this are lying. This also gave way to other hybrid threats. What's the point, a common point between between Ukraine and Africa? Wagner. Wagner is present everywhere. There is an international of terrorism. Wars have been taken down already, and it is necessary for us to tackle all of these challenges at once. These are a few elements of reflection I wish to share with you. I could have talked about the ingredients of the next military programming law, the new strategic national review. I could have talked about the European strategic compass. I could have talked about the new concepts of NATO, or how armies are preparing to these new challenges. But we shouldn't just keep this top-down approach. I just wanted to share a few elements of reflection. These to me are very important. I'm convinced that we have our own wars within our society. We must arm ourselves to take them down. This, if we want to carry this peace project for Europe, and this peace project is also the project of the Republic.
Merci. Yesterday morning we mentioned the wars as obstacles to
peace, for a durable peace, we need to break down walls. But how? This is the question that we're going to explore together all along this morning. And in order to set the terms for the debate, I'd like to ask the person who, alongside Bertrand Badier, is the scientific director of our forum. And I'd like her to join us now. She's a specialist in European and international security subjects, vice president of the Jacques Delors Institute, and professor emeritus at the CNAM. Welcome, Nicole Gnezoto.
Merci beaucoup, Frédéric.
Thank you, Frédéric. Thank you, François-Xavier Priolo, for maintaining and improving each year this great forum for a citizen reflection, not only for experts, but also for citizens about the future of peace in the world. The former president of the CHOM, who I am, would like to comment on what the minister just said, but that's not what I'm here for today. So I will introduce this second session. Our world is injured by war. It is struck by climate chaos, by hate. It is full of shame, poverty, and diversity. This is not a sentence by a poet, by a bad poet, not from a science fiction author. It is a sentence starting the letter from the General Secretary of the UN, Antonio Guterres, sent this week to the opening of the session of the General Assembly at the UN, to all the heads of state. And Antonio Guterres is not a man who exaggerates, or he's not a literature person either. Our world is broken by war, struck by climate chaos, struck by hate, covered in shame, and struck by poverty. So what the Secretary General of the United Nations cannot hide is that we are in a situation which is very difficult and dark. I think we all have the feeling that everything is going too fast towards the worse, whether it's on the climate front, war front, economic, energy. We all have a feeling, and we have yesterday spent a great day trying to describe how many walls separate, fracture, divide, including in war, our human societies. And on this dark portrait, our task, I'm not saying it's more difficult than yesterday, but it is a very important task that we have to try and offer solutions, tools, in order to reunite our common humanity. So, Mr. Minister, you're right. The history, remembrance needs to lighten the way, in particular in Normandy. But history shouldn't, if it is lighting the way, it shouldn't blind us either. And I think it's important today to look at the walls, the crisis of today, and try to invent solutions for today. The answers from yesterday are not useless. Yesterday we had a debate about the blocs in Europe that make a comeback, and it's obvious that it is a truth, but the answer is not the one that was given in the 50s when we initiated the Cold War. So I think we're in that situation where remembrance is important, but imagination, innovation, and I think William Sansem was saying it yesterday, we need to invent over and over again new tools that are adapted to today's crisis. Traditionally, these tools separate in three domains: tools to break down walls, which are diplomacy, trade, and culture. Commitment towards education and culture. So these 3 points that are going to affect the roundtables of this morning. So first of all, diplomacy. A diplomat is somebody who attempts to break down walls. It is somebody, as Shakespeare was saying, who accepts to talk with the devil. He wasn't talking about the diplomats, but he said, you need to talk to the devil, but with a big spoon. So a diplomat can even talk without spoon, at the point that when a country calls back an ambassador, we can feel that we're close to a war or simply a crisis. So today, diplomacy and its role, I know that there are reforms undergo in this country to suppress a certain number of ambassadors, a reform that I do not support, by the way. But diplomacy plays an essential role, and I'd like to give 2 examples. First of all, the Berlin Wall, constructed on the 12th of August 1961, is broken down the 9th of November 1989. 18 years during which we believed that the Berlin Wall was uncrossable. The Soviet Union would last forever, that maybe there would be an economic opening, but that there would be no change. But this wall broke down in one night, peacefully, with hammers, thanks to citizens. The wall broke down because the regime broke down, and because of because people pushed for freedom. So what can we conclude for our subject? That means that no wall can exist forever. No wall cannot be crossed. Even the one that we believed would exist forever was broken down. So giving up is not an option. And diplomacy here has played no role whatsoever. However, diplomacy was essential the next minute to frame, control, follow up on the evolutions following this year of 89. And I have to say, Western European diplomacy and the US also played a great part in the negotiation 2+4 between Germany and Russia. This was a great element to maintain this revolution, decolonization of the Soviet Union for peace. Not a single bullet was shot. Another example is Taiwan. You're going to say in Taiwan there's no walls, and that's true, but there is a Detroit, the Fornos Detroit, 180 kilometers at its smallest point, and there's also political and strategical ideological wall from China, who considers that Taiwan is the 23rd province of China, that it needs to be reattached and melted together with China. And then, of course, the people from Taiwan who disagree want to maintain their autonomy, political system, democracy, etc. So this example, I believe, is interesting because it asks the question, should we always want to destroy the walls? The security of Taiwan relies since 1971 on an ambiguous strategy, which is that Taiwan doesn't declare its independence, China doesn't invade, and the US doesn't support nor defend. So the fate of Taiwan means that peace is lasting. And now wanting to destroy the wall is a great risk. Today, China goes towards ultranationalism, which puts back and questions this status quo, but the US as well. I consider that Madame Pelosi in Taiwan was a great mistake. It didn't improve the security in Taiwan, but worsened it. Now the question is, should we want to destroy all walls? Are there not situations in the world where the maintaining of a status quo is more of a stability than revolution and destruction of a wall would be? A second subject, trade. Trade since Montesquieu, maybe even before, some experts will be able to tell us this. Trade helps to make things more peaceful. The natural effect of trade is to bring peace to two nations negotiating together. They become dependent on one another. And in the West, for a long time, since the 17th, 18th century, we rely on this philosophy, which has really marked the European construction. The interdependency between France and Germany in 1951, but then also between Europeans who banned war between Europeans. So trade is really a source of peace since the Second World War. And then also globalization. We lived and rested on this belief that the more we have globalization, so the more we have this international trade, more peace we have. This is what Francis Fukuyama had also said in his theory in 1995, saying that globalization could be the end of history. But we know now that this belief, this liberal illusion, is also an illusion. We've seen it during COVID, where we realized that our interdependence is also a source of strategic dependence. When we realized that painkillers couldn't be made without using raw material from China to 99%, at this point we realized that interdependence is also a strategic risk. And we also see it with the war in Ukraine, which questions this as well. If trade brings peace, logically, Russia should have never attacked Ukraine. It completely depends on its exports of oil and gas. However, they still attacked Ukraine. So there are situations in the world where trade has no influence on geopolitics between countries. Countries can misunderstand their interests and put their will for annexation before their economic interests. So I think we need to rethink our beliefs about trade. And this is a challenge in particular for the EU, who, as you know, has based its power on the advantages of world trade. Now, my last point about more virtual tools. Education, culture, commitment, engagement. I think we have always, and today as well, we have walls in our heads separating Europeans, humanity. I'm not going to mention them all, but I think for a few years now there's been two great breaks, cultural and politics, in the West, talking about confrontation and not integration. First of all, a first divide, which is cultural and religious, one from Samuel Huntington, which is a clash, he mentioned in the 90s, a clash of civilizations, religions, and there's also another virtual wall in our heads, and it has been for about 15 years. It's reborn. It's the wall of opposition, frontal opposition between democracies on one side and autocracies on the other. This wall today is much more important and urgent with the war in Ukraine. Again, I don't have time to comment. But these two aspects are the two virtual divides, walls in our heads, who really are bad for what happens in our institutions. They really become instances of exclusion. And this is where our commitment, our personal, collective commitment, and we will have some interventions at the end of this session, that's where this is important. Education to break down the walls in our heads. And my last word will be to mention Albert Camus. Those who know me know that I love Albert Camus. And in conclusion, I have this great sentence: what is man? It is a force, a power, which always ends up mixing up tyrants and gods. Thank you for this great introduction, which really starts us off into the great subjects that we are going to talk about today. You also have your book, L'Europe changer ou périr, which is published by Thaïlandier, which you'll be able to purchase at the village bookshop. I am going to now present to you our morning. First of all, we're going to talk about diplomacy, because today, at the moment, we're faced with the world's disorder and it's back. And we have our backs against the wall. Then we will talk about the economy, questioning the ability of the market economy to break down walls. And finally, the future. The youth is rising up against the walls, but with what weapons? So first of all, we'd like to introduce General Abu Tarka, President of the High Authority for Peace Building in Niger, Delphine Ambassador, Secretary General of the Generation Equality Forum, Xavier Driancourt, former French ambassador to Algeria, Jean-François Di Meglio, President of the Asia Center.
À côté du général, Monsieur Driancourt, je vous propose de vous mettre là à côté de Nicole et Monsieur Di Meglio. Voilà. Installez-vous.
Alors, on va aborder en effet ce thème de la diplomatie.
So we are going to talk about diplomacy with our backs against the wall. General, your mission in Sahel is the fight against jihadism, against clandestine terrorist groups. We talk about diplomacy, but when we talk about diplomacy, we need to have a person who we can talk to, who we can discuss. The issue with these jihadist groups is that we don't have somebody to talk to. So how can we have a dialogue when we have no official interlocutor in front of us? Thank you for your question. Indeed, because of the diversity of people here in the room, I'd like to give a bit of context. So we're talking about the Sahel. Sahel is this region in the south of the Sahara. They are countries between Mauritania and Sudan, but we're going to focus on Central Sahel, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali. Mali is the epicenter of the crisis in Sahel. In Sahel, there is a war happening, opposing states and opposing different jihadist groups, Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, etc. The particular aspect of this Islamic terrorists is that they don't want to discuss. They want to impose a project, a political project. And this is sometimes meaning that you need to die in order to realize this political goal. But because the terrorism in Sahel is insurrectional, it's a political project, and they recruit populations. They try to convince people to follow them, and this is how we are also trying to break down this system in our countries. A moment ago, in its introductory word, the minister talked about the disorder in the world. So since what is happening in the Ukraine, do you feel the consequences, the effects on your territory? I'm happy that the minister has mentioned the implication of France in Sahel. It's important to say it's important, but it's not sufficient. The work needs to be done by Sahel itself. The governments in our regions are responsible. France is there to help, to supply military tools that are not up to date, they're not ready. Of course, we have had a few worries when we all turn to Ukraine, but I think the commitment of France, the engagement of France and the Western countries in Africa are necessary. Africa is just next door. So you say that we need to talk to the population, but concretely, how do you officialize this dialogue with the population? You need to talk with the communities, the population. You need to correct the errors that the states have carried out. This war is something that was born following injustice, negligence of a big part of our population, in particular the nomads who were subject to climate shocks. There is a big crisis and exclusion. And during the colonial time, we were saying that nomads are left behind, and our states didn't manage to include these nomads. And now we integrate the Tuaregs, the Peuls, the Arabs in Sahel into our states, because they are the basis of our agricultural regions. So we need to integrate. This is the basis. And when the jihadists arrived, they instrumentalized the anger of the nomads. And this is where we need to find a solution. We need to have a dialogue with them. We need to have a dialogue with the communities. We do not negotiate with the jihadists. That's what we need to mention as well. What you describe, we understand that traditional diplomacy has reached its limits. You need to find other ways to discuss, to talk. Yes, and it's really the field that tells you how to act. If you want to solve an issue, you go to the field, you see how you can make things move. And now the challenges that we are confronted with, not only you, not just interstate issues, but now I turn to Delphine O, and as an ambassador for equality between men and women, you naturally make this observation. Could you share with us what, according to you, the new rules of the game are?
Yes, good morning, everyone. I would like to talk about a gap today, not a wall. We didn't really talk about this gap until yesterday. It was mentioned this morning by the minister and by Nicole, the values gap regarding the universalism of values, the gap that is being dug between liberal democracies and dictatorships and autocracies. And I would like to link that with gender equality. What's the common element of speech that we can find in the statements of dictatorships and autocracies, whether they are liberal or communist, whether they are in Europe or else? We can hear this rising tide of the lack of virility of the West. These liberal democracies that are decadent, that legalize same-sex marriage and give a place to LGBT people. When you read these speeches of Vladimir Putin, what do you hear? You hear that Ukraine deserved to be raped. You hear that the West has been robbed of his virility. I think liberal democracies for several years have abandoned this field, this figurative field. Mr. Minister, you've mentioned cyber threats, agricultural threats, energy threats, but I will add to that list the topic of inequality, and the first inequality is the one separating one half of humanity from the other. The topic of gender diplomacy, equality is traditionally tackled as a secondary, subsidiary topic, a humanitarian topic. But it has become a battlefield. Look what happened in the USA with the reversal of the Roe versus Wade amendment. Look at what happened with the in Hungary, where the word gender cannot be used any longer. Look what's happening in Brazil, in Russia, in China in terms of women's rights regression. So today, the field of diplomacy must indeed go beyond walls and tackle these topics, because these are not just soft power topics. They're not secondary topics. They're hard power topics. Everything related to to social equality. Social topics are hard power topics. I'm very proud to be part of the Foreign Affairs Ministry today, but we must go further in the field of diplomacy, international law. And I remind that the CEDAW, International Convention for Elimination of All Forms of Violence Against Women, is the UN convention with the highest number of signatories. It was adopted in 1979, more than 40 years ago. Today, this international law is questioned by states. It was questioned by the Trump administration. It's questioned more and more by Russia. The language that we've all commonly adopted, this consensus on gender equality, is being questioned. When we listen to you, Delphine, or after the intervention of the general, we can tell that diplomacy is a bit is on the fence, right? Because it's not as efficient as it used to be on some specific fields, because it does not address the needs of constituted bodies, and it's not present enough in other fields, which means we should add some diplomacy on the topics that you've just mentioned. So how do you add diplomacy when you do not deal between relationships between states? Well, I think we need to act at two levels, at the conventional and traditional level. That means UN-related bodies in the member states. These are the grounds we must act on. We have renewed our efforts with other states to work on women's rights. We had stopped working on this because we thought it was already acquired. No one thought that the US would go back to on abortion. During that gap, during that lapse of time, conservative states, autocratic states, what the President of the Republic rightly calls the international of conservatisms, these people asserted their messaging, saying women are not entitled all these rights, they must stay home, sexual and reproductive rights are a Western invention. So we must stay vigilant and strong on these topics. So we must invest other fields. Traditional diplomacy must leave its traditional grounds. A few years ago, we organized a great forum called the Generation Equality Forum. And it's not just a typical governmental meeting. We gathered around the table, NGOs, the civil society, the youth, trade unions, businesses, foundations, philanthropical foundations, all the stakeholders of civil society, of this social body that must be more resilient. So we took decisions together, and we mobilized during this forum that was co-organized by France and Mexico and UN Women, $40 billion to make strides on gender equality. I think our diplomacy's legitimacy today is about going beyond these governmental meetings that are essential, yes, but we must also include civil society in all of its components. General, I can see you taking down a few notes. Do you want to react? Yes, our friend here talked about liberal and autocratic regimes. Makes me think that in Sahel you have several stakeholders today, state actors, foreign actors. I was saying that to resolve this crisis in the Sahel, we must show compassion, we must show intelligence in how we analyze the situation, and we must stand side by side with the population. Democracies are often standing with their population, not authoritarian regimes. So what's happening in the Sahel? Well, democracies are disappearing in the three states that I've mentioned, Niger, Burkina, and Mali. There were military coups in Mali and in Burkina. And what comes with military coups? Always authoritarian regimes. Who's their ally? Other authoritarian regimes. That's how Wagner started coming to Mali, and they are making incursions in the other liberal regime in Burkina. They're trying to settle down. What does that mean? It means these countries are unable to solve this issue. It's not just a military issue, it's a political issue. It's an issue of dialogue. We must break the wall between the populations. We must garner their support. We are not able to get it. If you follow the news, there are massacres carried out by Wagner. So we're absolutely not taking the right way. In Niger, we have a different approach. This is a democratically elected regime aligned on liberal democracies of the West. It's a new element as well being placed in this Sahel context. Both of you have said it. Diplomacy must go beyond its traditional field of action. So I will address Xavier Driancourt. You were French ambassador in Algeria. We can see that the scope of diplomacy is widening, as are the actors. That being said, in terms of diplomacy, long-termism is important, it's crucial. You were twice ambassador in Algeria. We know the wall between France and Algeria, the lack of understanding, the resentment, the wounds. Can we talk about a diplomacy of remembrance if we were to heal these wounds? Good morning, everyone. The topic of remembrance was defined by the minister. It was mentioned again by Florence. You've described all these different walls, and it's true that remembrance can be one of these walls. During the 8 years I was posted in Algeria, the minister himself was there a few days ago. This topic of remembrance is at the heart of our relationship with Algeria beyond other points such as Sahel. This topic of remembrance has become a war not so long ago. In 1962, in 1970, in the 80s, very few people touched upon that remembrance with Algeria. It's only after 2003, after the failure of the friendship agreement between France and Algeria, after 2005, after the new laws on remembrance, after the law on Armenia, after the French law on colonization. Only after these did the remembrance topic become an obstacle and a challenge. This afternoon, I believe there will be a debate on a relationship between France and Algeria. So we can tell we must try different methods. There were unilateral statements of President Chirac, President Sarkozy, President Hollande, and then candidate, and then President Macron. Everyone said something on remembrance. We're trying to negotiate. We're going to try and set up a commission of historians. But we still see that memory and history are huge obstacles on that path. We were able to do that with Germany. Will we succeed with Algeria? Time will tell. Nicole, do you want to react to what was just said? Yes, quickly. First of all, on the importance of this sub-etatic diplomacy against walls of remembrance, walls of inequalities, walls of difference. I think it's one new element in our modern societies. Regarding what you were saying, Mr. General and Mrs. O. On this gap between democracies and autocracies. Of course, we can see it every single day. This divide makes sense. Of course, as you were saying, authoritarian regimes always start by enslaving women. I'm personally very worried by the internal political evolution of the US. That being said, I do think we must defend democracy and its values, but we must also clean up our own mess. I think it's inadmissible that Poland and Hungary appear as great liberal countries in the struggle against Russian authoritarianism, whereas these two countries, specifically Hungary, threaten and repress democracy and freedom in their own countries. You cannot be the champion of freedom in the foreign stage and the champion of populism within your borders. That's impossible. So we must be honest on this clan of democracy that's leaking. I like how you go about things, Nicole. It's very, very firm. I think it's what we do at the Normandy Peace Forum. We are never tongue-in-cheek. So I was thinking about your intervention with this logic of blocks, you know. You have the progressists and conservatives, and that's where the battlefield is. We're going to carry on with this, but first we're going to turn to you, Jean-François Dimeglio. Through your expertise, we're going to now go to Asia. As we've said, democracy must reinvent itself. Traditional diplomacy must be open to new methods. Through the French-Algeria relationships, we understand that time must also do its work. And it's a very cultural question. As a specialist of Asia, you talk about cultural wars. There are still wars that are standing in Asia, such as the wars between the two Koreas. And we can also talk about the rising tensions between China and Taiwan. We saw in Europe that all diplomatic efforts with Russia have failed, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine could not be averted. Do you think we should fear a similar scenario between China and Taiwan? Thank you very much for touching on this topic. Obviously, it's dear to my heart, and I'm very glad that this forum at last gave it front and center place. Mrs. Gniazotso took the example of Taiwan as one of the very hot topics of our time. I think we are all convinced it is, and it very probably will be for the months to come. So you allude to these persisting wars in Asia. We should start by remembering that, contrary to what happened in Europe, one of the reasons these tensions persist in Europe after World War II, contrary to what was done in Western Europe, the nationalistic tensions were not overcome. We have examples of this. Some things we do not think of, but for example, the remembrance and tensions between Korea and Japan. Very high tensions, which in the West would have been appeased, because if we go back to the logic of blocks, although we should be careful about this approach, normally Korea and Japan are supposed to be part of the same bloc, but there are tensions simmering between them because Asia hasn't taken down all the walls, especially those which are theoretically easier to take down. So we said much about wars. Madam, you were talking about the benefits of wars. In the case of Taiwan, this invisible wall, this protecting Taiwan, well, had there not been a useless wall called the Great Wall of China, which, by the way, never prevented anyone from entering China, if there was not this persisting will to rising walls, to raising a cyber wall, to recreate a Great Wall of China, we would not be in this situation. So I'm not convinced that this invisible wall is preserving the status quo. I'm afraid, however, and I've seen that taking part in this debate. I was pressured yesterday because I'm taking part in this debate. So I'm afraid that this wall prevents any progress. Other means have been mentioned. You talked about Ukraine, France's efforts to the very last moment to use traditional diplomacy. I think we should still use traditional diplomacy. Diplomacy is all about words. It's the articulation of statements. It's always worked like this. Of course, it's different at the in the cyber era, in the era of digital G20 summits. It's tough to do traditional diplomacy, but we must stick to it. There's one diplomacy that was mentioned several times, the one that Camus mentions when he says that the fate of men is to do away with tyrants. It's what we call people to people. So in parallel of this official diplomacy, we must have what we call the track point 5. This is the parallel diplomacy, people talking to people. I have this marvelous experience that I actually managed to set up discussions between academia from both sides of the Formosa Strait in Taiwan and China. And I dream that someday it will also happen in other places of Asia. Diplomacy between people can yield great results and can yield what Camus was saying. And this Chinese tyranny is a tyranny of a new order.
So with these parallel circuits of diplomacy, of using all the channels of dialogue that exist and with their efficiency, and if we react to what you just said, Mr. Di Melio, about Algeria, we have the subject of reconciliation as well. When we talk about a long time, we need to talk about history, about culture, that make that diplomacy not all of a sudden can silence decades, centuries of history. And so how can we differentiate Asia, Europe, the relationship between France and Algeria? We can't apply the same methods everywhere. We need to take into account historical reality. How can we take into account also what populations feel? I think, yes, I'd like to highlight how important history is in our reflections. And if there is a corner of the world where time and history is long but important, it's Asia, because of the continuity of some Asian civilizations, also because of some regimes that have a long life, for example, China. But also they have a capacity to say that in the cycle that we find ourselves in, at some point there can be another cycle. And I'm also thinking it's the case of China, again, behind the horizon that we believe to be finite. I think there is also another possibility, and when we talk about an interlocutor from a different country, I think we need to be conscious about this, that our democratic regimes will know a change, and there is even more of that a sustainability, a durability in these countries that see a sustainability before seeing a rupture. So that's important to talk about. I think we need to talk about the long term. China will not be in the future China that we know today. A last word, Xavier Driancourt. The question of remembrance has also been present between a former colonizing country and colonized countries. We've seen Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, Spain, opening and presenting excuses regarding their past. But the remembrance and history can also be used in international life. Russia, by appealing the history of the Great Russia, doesn't it instrumentalize as well this history? And China, on their side, don't they use history for their strategic ambitions and not for diplomacy but war? So we saw how we can rewrite history, use propaganda, reinvent things. We see it clearly. A last reaction from Madame O and then Nicole Niesotto. On the question of long time, of these cycles, I think there's a great quote from Martin Luther King saying, "The art of progress is long but bends toward justice."
Il va aboutir un jour à la justice. Et c'est une citation.
And this is a quote that those who fight for human rights, defend the women's rights and other causes, always try to remember every day. For example, in the US, not just Asia, history and time is long. When we look what's happening in the US today with the rights for abortion, feminist organizations and human rights organizations in the US, they have been saying this for a long time. They said, be careful, one day abortion rights will be questioned in the US. And the public people said, no, it's the biggest democracy in the world. There will be no setback. In France, there will be no setback. In Europe, there will be no setback. But actually, for years now, fundamentalist evangelical organizations finance campaigns at the Congress, in the federal states, on the only platform of banning abortion. So this is really a long haul, and they've been working on this for decades to create this setback of Roe v. Wade. And these fundamental rights, we can't say that they can never be questioned, never be turned around in favor of political regimes, ideological changes. And I believe, and if I want to believe, and I have hope, when people say that we go towards less equality, I think the reality shows us that there are still inequalities, but also there is an emergence in conservative countries, in particular the last 20 years, where they present themselves to electors in Russia as well, in a platform that's openly conservative, and that is for the regression of fundamental rights. Nicole, yes. So one word on what you just said. I think there are weak signals that we need to spot, and it's not necessarily the responsibility of diplomats. But also in the US, there is another weak signal that's worrying. It's some conservative states eating up the rights to vote by democratic minorities. And I think that's important. We don't mention it, but we're talking about internal logistics, so you can't vote after that time, etc. So they are eating up slowly but surely the rights to vote. So, but also about the remembrance. I think there is a very nice way of overcoming this wall of remembrance in Algeria in particular. It is culture and literature. The example that I'd like to give here is the one of an exchange between the book of Albert Camus, L'Étranger, which had great support in the West. I think there's many students here today, and I think most of them will read L'Étranger. And if you remember, the one who's getting killed is an Arab person. We don't know anything about him, his family, his name, where he came from. It's just an Arab person. And this really reveals France at the time when Albert Camus wrote this text. And then a few years ago, a book was published by an Algerian, Kamel Daoud, called Merceau contre-enquête, and it's the opposite of L'Étranger. Kamel Daoud is asking who was this Arab person that Camus killed in his book. So this book goes and looks for the name and the family of this man who was killed, and it's a great tribute to the reconciliation. And to read those two texts together, you can see that literature can overcome the wall of remembrance. And I really regret that Kamel Daoud didn't get a Goncourt Prize. I think maybe we should invite him. Thank you so much. A round of applause, please. Thank you.
Nicole, vous restez ici. Vous à nos intervenants de regagner.
So we will ask our speakers to leave the floor. So now we are talking, of course, a lot about the war in the Ukraine. 3 days ago, Vladimir Putin talked about the partial mobilization, and how can we not? Because on the 21st of September, it's the International Day for Peace. Nicole just mentioned literature, and it's true that in these conflicts, in war, culture needs to have its space as well. And between the refugees, the person displaced from Ukraine who are in various European countries, many are also in France. Here also in Normandy, we have artists, and they continue to create with their theatre. This will be at the Drama Center, the National Dramatic Center, and Catherine Morin-Desailly is very involved in this. I'll let you watch 1 minute of a movie who presents this project. It's a creation called Macabre Dance, presenting their project. So the 24th of February, invasion of Russia in Ukraine. I called them straight away and I said, I am here. If you need me, if you need to protect your family, your kids, Le Préau, I will be there, committed with you. And so they could work. They're not just refugees, they're artists, and therefore this is useful. And they can talk about what happened in the Ukraine. And this is the art front, so fighting thanks to art. She called all of us saying, I am expecting you. We're going to work together at the theatre. Of course, this has given us a lot of hope. We are very thankful to be able to give our message thanks to art. It is very important for us here to tell people what is happening at home, the war, the aggression from Russia against the Ukraine. People meet in a dark room at the theatre. They don't have a possibility to necessarily scroll and look at the news. The information is different here. It is alive. The girls on the stage, they work, they play, they live. So you'll be able to watch the rest of this little film in the village, but also online, and the show will be on the 6th of October. We talked about diplomacy, and now we're going to talk about economics. Politics and economics have a complex relationship. They are even sometimes intertwined, and if international relations have an obvious impact on the world economy, does trade have the capacity to break down walls? This is a big question that we will ask our guests now. Let's welcome together Maxence Brichoux, senior civil servant, author of the book Le Commerce et la Force, as well as Stéphane Raison, managing director of Aropa Port, the port of the Seine Axis, which is the largest port in Europe. We are going to start this round table with you, Maxence Brichoux. You wrote this book, Trade and Strength. So there is a common belief that trade can bring peace, and so the intensification of exchanges should promote peace, because nobody would need to have less trade and do it by war. So, however, in your book, you also promote the opposite. Explain to us our thesis, please. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be with you. The first round table was really a rich wealth, so I hope the level will be the same here. I wrote this work, Trade and Strength, from my personal experience, because my responsibility was on trade when Trump launched his war against his trade war against China and Europe and the whole multilateral system. And I worked on the question of the globalization and the changes of economic changes and the nature of international systems, etc. So this is rather an old idea that we can find in Montesquieu or in Kant as well. So indeed, I can say that the last events in the Ukraine really make us think again. The question is now not theoretical anymore, but it's very practical. As Nicole said, we have seen two things. First of all, the economic interest to continue the relations, the exchanges. This didn't stop the war from happening. And quite the opposite. Now we also have a conflict of will, which is very strong, brutal. And we observe it on economic exchanges with sanctions and with counter-sanctions, blocus and stopping of delivery of oil and gas. Now we see that there is a manipulation, as experts call it, of economic relations. Now the question, to go a bit further on the news, where does this idea come from? Why have we thought that extending exchanges to reduce conflict and could even bring durable peace, making conflicts impossible? So I think that this is an idea which has got a long story. At some point the idea was new, and it was new in the intellectual world. Nicole mentioned Montesquieu, but I think the first formulation is older, and it comes from Voltaire. Voltaire, in 1930, his philosophical letters, which is a message from the UK where he was in exile. So I think this is what at the heart of what we're talking about. Entering London, you will see all members of the stock market. You have Jews, you have Christians. Everybody gets along together as if they were the same religion. And only infidels, unfaithful, those who are bankrupt. I think this is quite funny. We can. There is a real level here. We can always give a round of applause to Voltaire, of course. So this declaration is always right. If you go to a stock exchange in New York or in London, capitalism is cosmopolitical. It reunites all religions. And I think the point here is that the economic interest transforms all borders, that you need to invest, exchange, make profit. This transcends all the barriers, whether they are religious or ideological or other. And your interest to perpetuate your relations that are good for both should prevent conflict and taking up arms. So now about this point as well, Montesquieu also takes it up, Kant as well, and others, they always go back to this. But trade really doesn't make us better. It doesn't make us less violent, but the economic interest will discipline. So you won't be better, but in the end, all the villainous passions will be disciplined by the fact that they are controlled. In the end, you want to have your bread, your gas, your Chinese smartphone, rather than conflict. So what I talk about in this book is really trying to look at the argument from all sides, see what's right or wrong, and we really see that fundamentally it goes to human psychology. And why is interest not such a strong power? And in the end, I think we can look at it through a few ways. So with war in Ukraine, what we see is that the goals, the geopolitical goals, and the ideologies, all of that is stronger, have more power, more energy than trade interests. The other aspect then is does not bring political freedom. That's also what we saw in the 90s with China. Globalization should have brought democratization. That's really the opposite of what we could see in the end. And then to conclude, this is fundamental. The economy doesn't allow to solve political issues, to say it simply. Political problems call for political answers, and it's not by spreading trade with growth, investments, etc., that you're going to solve political problems. They are quite simple. It's those of wars, of international balance. They need diplomatic answers. You need military dissuasion and others, and then we also need political answers, fights, and to make sure that you preserve rights for freedom. So, in the end, in conclusion, the economy is not that important in the end, and political problems need a political reflection, but men and women that are committed, who are fighting and protect what we have the most, which is the most important to us, which is freedom.
C'est passionnant.
It's fascinating. We understand that even though the cost is high, well, the economic interest is not enough to dissuade men from war. Let's carry on. There was this sort of global vision, but we will now zoom in on Europe. Over the last few decades, Europe was a source of inspiration for peace. We often talk about its organization around a community of law, a common market, a currency, the euro. So all of this would have been a factor of peace. But here again, Maxence Bréchou, you contest this vision. You think it's not the EU that built peace. It's because peace had come back to the continent that the EU was possible. Right? Yes, I'm not a Eurosceptic either. I've been practicing European affairs for 10 years in different fields. Fundamentally, I think there's a lot of uncertainties, of doubts, a lack of understanding about what Europe is, to the point where I'm quite perplexed, to be honest. We can't even tell if the European construction goes forward or backward. Minister was saying that after the Ukraine invasion, there was a feeling of solidarity, but we have a feeling that Europe only reacts to crises. But there are factors of disaggregation internally. There's a structural vagueness here in what Europe is, and it's sometimes difficult to understand even for myself. So two simple elements to try and clarify the European situation. First of all, I think this was proved by historical causality, the peace of 1945 that allowed for reconciliation and the fusion of our economies. France lost in 1940, Germany lost in 1945, so these two belligerents are KO, or knocked out, and there's a Soviet threat, which is why the Americans stay on the continent to maintain a European order. That's the basis upon which the great European initiatives are built, which does not mean that these were marginal. They've had a huge economic impact. And second element of simplification now. All our economy was communalized, was put in common. There's no such thing as a national economy. All the national economies were Europeanized, especially through the common market, fundamentally through the euro currency, which is very much at the heart of everything through the European Central Bank. So the economies were Europeanized. So we are governed by Europe on economic matters. Gas, monetary policy, inflation. The other fundamental basis is that there was no transfer of political legitimacy at the European level, right? We do not feel governed by the Commission, Parliament, and Council, and even ECB. So there's a major hiatus between the need for monetary governance of the EU and the fact that institutions' legitimacy were not fully allocated to the European level. This translates to the fact that legitimate decisions in times of crisis are taken by the European Council, because these are the head of state of the member states. So they have democratic legitimacy to take decisions, and I think it works. There were no complete failures in this respect, but we are now suspended to this European Council, gathering 27 heads of state, often alone without their advisors, discussing in their room in Brussels, negotiating communiques, statements, and we just wait on the doorstep with the press in front of the microphones in order to know what was said in this Council of Head of States. So, economic Europe is already done. They're even renewing industrial policy, but the decision-making process remains intermediated with the heads of state that keep all legitimacy. I'll conclude saying that all of this was predictable at the end of War and Peace between nations. Raymond Aron uses the concept of clandestine federalism, saying there's no spontaneous and needed way from the economy to politics. So integration of markets does not replace political unity at a federal level. Now I turn to Stéphane Raison. You're the director of Aropa Port, one of the greatest ports in Europe. Until recently, we thought that the political world was impotent in the face of finance and economy, then in the face of... But now, since COVID and Ukraine, we are doubting these assertions. So you are on the outpost. What's your perspective on this? I will now start by a quote of Montesquieu. I will quote the President of the Republic. It was a few years ago in Montpellier on a Sea Economy Conference. He had declared the 21st century will be maritime. End of quote. I think he was perfectly right. The two crises that you've mentioned, even the two most recent ones, the crisis in Ukraine and the COVID crisis, are very symptomatic of this statement. On the one hand, if I just go back to as far as back as 1945, ports have gone through multiple crises. When you look at them, you can tell how resilient they've been. They were already quite resilient during the pandemic because port operators carried on transport traffics without gel, without masks, everything, and they helped the countries go through this health crisis. Secondly, when Russia blocks Ukraine ports and all the goods, especially cereals, cannot leave these ports, they destabilized one part of the Mediterranean basin. Secondly, to bounce back on what the President was saying, ever since 1961, we've invented a metal box called a container. 80% of world trade is put in a container. One interesting element about container is the fact that the first three ship owners are Europeans. It does give us a signal in terms of world trade, saying that on this specific field we did not cave in to other countries. The fourth ship owner is COSCO, is a Chinese ship owner, but it's not at the level of the first three, which are Europeans. 80% of world trade goes through ports, as I was saying. This is very much the vector of globalization. It shows our interconnectedness. I will not confront my neighbor here, but, well, you can if you want. But trade did soothe tensions. If I go back to ports and what they can bring to countries, there are instruments of sovereignty and there are instruments of peace. every time there's a conflict, the first strategic objective you seek to destroy is a port. Is what happened with Ukraine and Mariupol, which was completely destroyed. What I'm seeing today, maybe this reflection is not fully linked to the topic of the forum, but still, there's an acceleration of crises. If we look at all the crises we've gone through since 1947, they're all crises ever since 2009. We have an acceleration of crises. So all in 2014, COVID, Ukraine. I think we reached the end of a cycle, and it might be the beginning of a new cycle for economy, and this will have an influence on peace in the world. Second element, we are tools of globalization, and we need to look at cooperation between ports. My decision to lead this port was motivated by the president. It was taken by Edouard Philippe when he was prime minister, and we thought we were going to think at a different level. We said we were going to think at different territorial scales, levels, more important ones, wider ones, and we were going to work on cooperations, European process of cooperation. We talked to our colleagues in Bruges, in Bremen, Hamburg, Rotterdam, and Amsterdam. We can tell that we need to have these processes of cooperation in Europe. We need to talk to one another, and we need to make sure these tools work hand in hand. The idea about this cooperation is to build new instruments, new weapons, to make sure that all these tools are hijacked. Is that it? These ports, should we use them to be to resist better? This brings back to mind one event from the late 2010s. It was the French government's will back then to work on its gas sovereignty. Everyone forgot about this. The Energy Regulation Commission back then had launched the construction of 4 methane terminals, one in Verdun, one in Marseille, one near here, and one in Dunkirk. Of these 4, one was done. I was the one who built it near Dunkirk. Back in these days, one of the major arguments brought forward by the government or the Regulation Commission was the energy sovereignty of the French households. We were talking about how Putin was going to close the gas pipeline. And we can tell that ports, regarding the balance of countries, regarding energy prices today, ports are instruments with which you're very quickly able to find new solutions, new answers. So if I were to sum up all of this, I heard something earlier in what the minister said that stuck with me. It's the climate crisis. This will be a fundamental factor in the years to come. Our model was based for 2 centuries on a cheap and abundant resource that was oil, but this model will have to be changed very soon. There are very few places in Europe where you're able to re-industrialize, you're able to produce and transform fuels, where you're able to produce instruments for peace. These places are ports. These ports everywhere in the world must be transformed to, first of all, help with the tackling of climate crises. If we don't do that, I think we're not ready for what's coming for us in the years to come, even in terms of displacement of refugees. So if we do not tackle the topic of climate using easy tools that are at our disposal, we are going to live through difficult times. I would like to react, and I have a question. I'm convinced, just as you are, that port trade has a great future ahead of it in order to preserve trade, maritime communication. The Chinese are also convinced about this fact, and we've seen the level of Chinese investment in Europe. They completely bought the Piraeus port in 2009 and 10. That I know of, they've bought terminals in most great ports of Europe, in Le Havre, in Antwerp, Rotterdam, Valencia, and so on. How do you reconcile this trade freedom with our own geopolitical constraints? We don't really want the Chinese to control all of our ports. Yes, it's a very good question. I think there are two specific situations here, that of the Piraeus and that of Bruges. Bruges. Costco took a major part of the shares in these ports. Secondly, Terminal Link, a subsidiary of CMA CGM, is co-owner of a certain amount of different terminals. I think their positions are not even this important in Europe. For our European colleagues, it is, yes, a real question. How is China positioning itself, always with its great new Silk Roads plan, seeking to create a corridor between China and Europe? But yes, we are very vigilant on this topic. To finish this roundtable, I will turn again to Maxence Grichot. I think there's a thread in our debate. This the topic of sovereignty. We must rethink sovereignty. Everyone agrees on this. We must reconcile autonomy and security. And when I say security, I mean food security, energy security. But these days, the political speeches used the notion of sovereignty, playing with patriotism to sometimes slide back to nationalism. Isn't that dangerous? Well, in terms of sovereignty, there won't be a brutal removal from globalization. Ports will remain critical infrastructure for our supply. But we can tell there's a potential instrumentalization of any economic exchange, whether we talk about aspirin, masks, or anything. It's not just always the Chinese, but sometimes they also, yes, take monopolistic positions. So sovereignty would not be all about controlling everything, but controlling interdependence and avoiding being in a situation of domination and exploitation. Trade will be a potential source of conflict, it's true. The sovereignty needs a lot of economic and political decisions. Now, what will be its pillar? By playing with the vocabulary of sovereignty, do we risk waking up old demons? That's not the topic today, but I think I agree with the minister saying that in France, it's the weakness of the national sentiment that actually poses a question rather than the return of nationalism. What we're seeing in Ukraine and Russia is not exacerbated nationalism, but rather a neo-colonial attempt, a neo-imperial attempt. Since Russia at first wanted to avoid resorting to the conscription, and I think it will be very problematic for them. As for France, I think that the national framework is quite essential. What's nation, Renan was saying. At the end of the day, nation is a common preoccupation, something citizens share. There's obviously a right-leaning nation, right? The right-leaning citizen is more attached to order, rank, the place of France in the world. There's a left-leaning, there are left-leaning citizens where people are more attached to equality, social justice, but nation is all of this put together. And that's the pillar upon which modern democracies were built. I rather think we should rehabilitate or say restore the national framework. We can find that in the works of Pierre Manon. He said it was the framework where democracies were born. And I think the nation is the only place where democracy can thrive. Thank you very much, Maxence Brichot. I'll add that at 12:30 you'll be in the library to sign your own book, Trade and Strength. We can give them a round of applause. Thank you very much.
Public. Alors, vous savez,
As you know, the Normandy Peace Forum, ever since its inset, is dedicated to the youth, with young people taking part, doing animations, drawings. These young people are interested in the world they live in. The youth has always sought to bring down walls, but how do they do it? I will now invite Benoît Thiolin, Director of Seabrain France, former President of the National Digital Council, then Hadja Idrissa Ba, founding President of the Club of Young Girls Leaders of Guinea, and Albin Rey, young student, founder of Inc. for Peace.
Bienvenue à vous trois.
Welcome to all three of you. We'll start this round table with the oldest of these three guests, Benoît Thiolin, as former president of the National Digital Council. You are a keen observer of the evolution of uses and the impact of digital in our societies. Today we are reaching adulthood, the famous digital natives, those people who were born with the digital technology, for whom digital was a given. We realize that we're not just talking about a tool and techniques, but also culture and lifestyle. There's a general wall appearing, which is probably more a wall of incomprehension between those who master these codes and the others. And then at the same time, we can also be really flabbergasted by these young people who are succeeding to changing the lines in this digital world. Thank you for your invitation. I was very happy to be put with the youth. I think we also see the digital as something very innovative, and it's often an important lever that the youth use, and I did a few years ago as well, and these two guests will explain it to you later as well. I think we are living through a revolution, which we thought was a technological revolution that we wanted to reduce to that, but I think it's actually a revolution that is anthropological and cultural. I was lucky enough when I was president of the National Digital Council to welcome Bernard Stiegler, a great philosopher, saying that what we are living through, and you'll see the extent of what he was saying, this is probably a revolution that's also important at the level of history, as was going from oral culture to written culture. And I would say it's only 20, 30 years since, maybe a bit earlier, if we went to the starts of the digital era after the Second World War. So we see the revolution of this era and the consequences, the impact of it. So now, if we take a step back, a few things a few years ago have changed and dampened. So first of all, I think it's a revolution of empowerment. So the internet is a technology which is decentralized, giving power and weapons to all. And it is true that at the start, it's first of all those who didn't have these weapons, these media capacity of taking up the word, who weren't states and unions, companies, institutions. So those who didn't have this capacity of speaking up took these tools. And that's what we saw online. And even more so, since institutions, since autocracies, it's something that came from the civil societies and was very efficient. If you look at the world of activism, NGOs from the 90s, when the internet started with the wider public, it's really obvious. And if we keep looking now into this, you remember the Arab Spring. Nobody pretends that the Arab Spring was online, but nobody can say that the Arab Springs weren't supported by the internet, and in a different way as well. For example, Tunisia, if you look at the start of the revolution that's going to make Ben Ali leave the country, the head of the country. I mean, this was a regime that we thought, as Nicole was saying earlier, Ben Ali is nowhere near to leaving. And this is also what, thanks to publications and diplomatic cables, we're saying things that people in Tunisia knew, that the regime was corrupt, Ben Ali was taking everything, that it was a dictatorship. But this was written by US diplomats. And it was the start of a huge conversation in Tunisia. If you look at the connections on social networks at the time, inscriptions on Twitter, Facebook, etc., people go on these platforms not to talk with neighbors. And you see the levels of connections that really increase, explode. Why? Because there is a great discussion in Tunisia at the time about Ben Ali, his regime, what he's doing, etc. First thing. Secondly, the internet is a place for organization. We always say it's virtual. When you go on Facebook and you manage thousands of people to go to a place where it wasn't prepared for, you understand that online there is a capacity to organize, to invest physical places as well, which with consequences that can be a disaster. So an autocracy, thanks to the digital, if beforehand you were 3 and the windows of Ben Ali or Mubarak, the police would take you away. But if you organize it online and you say, we shouldn't be 3, we're going to be 50,000, well, then it's Mubarak or Ben Ali who takes the plane and disappears. And now I think this is a very powerful lever. Now, but since overcoming dictators, organizing the power, there is the start of an inversion now. We talked about the blues of the internet as well. We talked about leaving the innocence of the internet. We said, first of all, the internet is on the side of the weak, the activists, etc. But Obama saw it very fast. Straight after the first midterms, what appeared with the same means and tools that Obama used, it was the other parties that used it. So the opponents to Obama used the same recipe and ended up by bringing Trump to power. This is a bit of a caricature, but this is the idea behind it. And on the sides of autocracies, it's the same. At the start, I remember I was talking with Russian activists about 10 years ago. They were at the start of it, or they were saying, 5 years ago, everything was nice online, we were getting organized, nobody knew about it. And now the issue is to go offline because they have means and we can't go around them. So there was really a setback here, an inversion of taking up the ground that was lost by dictators, by mafias, and even in the radicalization. So I keep thinking this, when we thought that the internet is a tool for democracy and empowerment, you should also remember that this is in the hands of those who want something good, but it also means that people like Trump, jihadists can use it as well. Jihadists without the internet wouldn't exist. So in conclusion, just to put it together briefly, the examples that Nicole used, I think they are quite relevant. She talked about the Berlin Wall. I think we reconstructed walls in the digital world, and these walls today, we see it when we talked about it to prepare this discussion. We talked about the Ukraine and Russia, of course, China, therefore, as well. You know that the Chinese internet is the best separated internet. It's a balkanization of the internet. There is a space online, a national space of China, which is cut away from the rest of the digital world to be different. So there is what we call a great wall in the digital area where China is, and that means when you are inside of this wall in China, you can't have access to any content, and the content that you can publish is also going to be monitored by the Chinese authorities. So this is not absolute. This means that when I was in China online on my laptop and I was connected to Wi-Fi, I didn't have access to reports on human rights. But when I was on my 4G, international 4G via Orange with an agreement, I had more access. So it's not a wall that can stop anything, but this wall is very robust. We see it in Russia and we see it also in Iran. Today in Iran, one of the first things that was done by the authorities was to shut down the internet. How does that work? Doesn't that work? Both. Because every time you shut down the internet, and well, you encourage populations to arm themselves. So first of all, a VPN, so going around these digital protections created by authoritarian states, that was first of all something reserved, limited to geeks, activists. VPNs today are something very common, in particular in autocratic countries. So globally, there are so many people in Russia and also in Iran who use them. And therefore, this is more common. And every time you shut down the internet, you encourage your population to find ways, other ways to connect to the internet, which isn't censored compared to what you have inside. So that's the first point. Then, when you shut down the internet, you shut it down for everybody. And when you are in a society, even in an authoritarian society in China and Iran, if you cut down the internet, if you shut it down, yes, for activists, but you also do for the police, for people who go home at night, and you can do it a little bit, but you're blocking your own forces and you give a very bad image of yourself. So it's not that much of a good idea. So of course this stopped people to go down in the street and organize a protest, film victims and repression, etc. But you can still film and send it through other means. But Mubarak had done it as well and lived through it. He had shut down all telecommunications during the Tahrir protests. He had cut the communications in Cairo, and he had paralyzed the police. This lasted 2 days, and they were like, also, what do we do? So yes, we stopped the activists, but we stopped ourselves as well. So they realized that it wasn't efficient. And I think that gives you an idea, and I'd just like to finish on the second point that Nicole was mentioning. Time is running. On Taiwan, there is the maritime wall, which is a protection. And in the West, let's say in the free world, we will need, in a certain way, to construct walls, digital walls for protection. The minister was saying about it. Hospitals need to have walls to protect from attacks from digital terrorists. So we shouldn't be completely naive. It's not the free trade. And in our societies, we have many phenomena of radicalization of people, of theories that are developed, and it's not just to be naive and think that digital, by breaking down walls, can develop in a prosperous way. Thank you very much, Benoît Thiolin. This double stake, and I think Adair Salja wants to react to this. You were born with the internet. You are an activist, a feminist. You're very committed and engaged since you're 12 years old. For 4 years, you were at the president of the Parliament of Children in Guinea, and you have also founded the Club for Young Girl Leaders in Guinea. You have a whole fight against female genital mutilation and early and child marriage. So how can you explain to us that the young girl, the 12-year-old girl that you were, had the force, the strength, the audacity to go and overcome ancestral walls? Thank you very much to all of you. I would like to go back to this name, the girl with headscarf who breaks down child marriage. Well, I don't break down all marriages, let's say it. And why did I start this fight when I was 12? First of all, because I was born in a big conservative family. I lived in inequality. I lived across inequalities. I was looking at my parents, my aunts, my wider family suffering from violence because simply they are women. I lived and grew up in this world, in this environment. And then I was mutilated when I was 8. And then I had access to education. And I learned from my friends that there is a better world. There is a better world because these children who had parents who knew that FGM wasn't good, they told me, and I raised up in revolt. First of all, within my own family. And then I found my path. I joined the Children's Parliament, where I was fighting for the children's rights. And this is also, I made the decision to fight against child marriage. Because if I didn't lead this fight, I would be subject to it as well. So I had to protect myself, my friends, everybody from the same generation, the people from my neighborhood or elsewhere. And what happened is that today I feel the emergency, and talks were not sufficient. The laws that were voted, the conventions ratified by Guinea protecting women and girls are not sufficient. And there had to be a revolution from the younger people. So when I was 16, I created my club of young girls, and we went to the place where marriages are celebrated. And when I had the information that this young girl is not 18 yet, then we use social networks to create a movement, threaten the police, make sure that these marriages are stopped, that we take this girl with us until we can find a solution, until the parents can sign a commitment that they're not going to get their daughter married until she's 18. That was the only strategy, because politicians didn't want to talk about it, authorities didn't, journalists didn't, and us people who are affected by it had to act. Otherwise, maybe tomorrow I would be celebrating my wedding, although I'm not 18 yet. So this was the situation, and this is why I started when I was 12, and until now I'm 23 and I continue to fight.
C'est extraordinaire parce que dans ces cas.
This is amazing. In a few words, we can imagine what that needs in terms of energy, determination, and it's a really interesting path. There are laws and treaties that are not taken into account. So you really need to act to make sure that change happens. So in a decade of fight, your path is really extraordinary. Now you bring your cause to the table of leaders of the world. You're 23 and you participated at the G7 in Biarritz. You took part in the Women's 7. You were invited by Macron with world leaders of the UN, of the Gates Foundation. So to break down walls in a certain way, you are building bridges and creating alliances. Is that your strategy? Yes. I think it's a question of survival. When I heard various interventions talking about economy, politics, climate, and all the wars of interest happening today in the world, when today the virus is destroying a world. This virus are practices that are being perpetrated across the world. Yesterday, I heard interventions on immigration. I heard people being angry about the fact that there are thousands of people coming from Africa dying in the Mediterranean today. Are we asking ourselves why most people coming here are looking for social security? Why are they looking for housing? Most of these women, if you notice, a big percentage of them are women who have lived violence based on gender, who have been mutilated, married by force. And if today we manage to find a solution together, because I am happy to see there is a diplomacy who is working with Madame Delphine O, for example, talking about the funds that are available. But when we take us into account as young people, I think this is when we will manage to try and find a solution, because we are not here just to look nice. We need to manage to communicate, exchange ideas, because this is about us. We've got the experience. We lived on the field. We know what is happening, and the solution is in our hands. We can't just, because on the 11th of October, which is the International Day of Women's Rights, and I can tell you that the politicians will have long speeches about the equality between men and women, and it's not going to stop here. There's going to be no concrete actions, because funds are there. Are you going to look for those funds if, for example, the Ministry of Women's Rights of my country doesn't even have 1% of the budget at the General Assembly? This is a ministry looking and caring for a vulnerable population of women and children, and it's not even 1% of the institution. How can we take into account these people? We need to talk about a solution. We need to find one. We don't have infrastructure, and we can't have a solution in Africa if education is not yet implemented where we are. This is an issue. There are no schools. We can't talk about healthcare centers. Maybe there will be some when we have schools. There is no follow-up of victims, of survivors, and you can be a victim of violence or rape, but there are no psychiatrists to help us. So if you want to be with us, if you want to help the world, you need to think about this. You need to think about the youth and take them into account, make them participate, and not use them as decoration, and not just for the International Day of something to say, yes, the youth is here, they participate, and then we put the files back into their drawers of funding, of availability, etc. This is the wall of postures. Maybe it's a question of generation, and they're going to say, yes, often when we make things look a bit younger, maybe it's not going to work, because this is the dictature of the all that should work. I'm sorry, but we've got a word to say, and of course I'm going to say For a few years, yes, there is more experience, but we have lived it. And I think maybe with today's world, we know what is happening. Not more than 2 months ago, a girl died because of FGM. Women are being stitched up, and one day after being wed, they are being raped. But politicians, the authorities, nobody talks about it, although it is an emergency. This is not COVID. It's not a virus. I think it is more than a virus. It's more than COVID. It's more than what is happening in the Ukraine. It is more than what is happening in these countries in Sahel. The emergency of the situation of women tomorrow. If tomorrow these women are in good conditions, I think the world is going to wake up in a very fairer manner.
Contre les solutions virtuelles dans le monde.
Against virtual solutions in the real world, and in favor of real solutions with the real people, the real youth, who shouldn't be just window dressing. I'll now turn to you, Albare. You are 17 years old. You are studying in law and political sciences. You were a high school student last year. A few days after the Russian invasion in Ukraine, you launched the initiative called Ink for Peace. What do you mean by that? First of all, thank you very much. Thank you for welcoming us in this beautiful place. Thank you for these interventions. The last intervention really moved me. Congratulations. I will try to come back to what you said. The Ink for Peace initiative, the idea is to question the role of the youth in world developments. Ink for Peace. The goal, since the Russian invasion, I have a correspondent. We've been in contact for 2.5 years. She is in Russia. She told me that she can't express herself in Russia. She explained to me that she was subjected to propaganda even in her school, and she explained to me that she wasn't free to express her opinion, to say that she disagreed. This testimony really moved me, and it just struck me, and it made me realize that we need to act. We need to give these people more room. We need to make them heard. Make sure that the youth doesn't stay passive in the face of what's happening. So we asked young people up until the age of 30 to send us a poem in their native tongue. And then we wanted to publish them on social networks. We will also publish a hardback format of the book. All profits will go to UNICEF for actions on the topic of peace. So the idea is to reaffirm the place held by youth in all of what's happening. And the idea is also to wonder how we can act. Early in the war, we were wondering, we were feeling more concerned. As a French person, I felt more concerned than by other conflicts. But I think that it's important to act for everything that's happening universally. But always wonder, how is it possible that we still have wars, violence, when we have such a heritage of remembrance, as the minister was saying? I think we can answer this question with culture, with art, and with a united youth that can maybe break down walls with its expression and imagination. Yes, I think we can give him a round of applause. It's very beautiful what you've just said. On this platform of the Normandy Forum for Peace, we always put culture and art front and center. It's obvious. And as we were preparing this roundtable, I understood that it's one first initiative for you, but it's quite clear you're committed to working on this in the long run, to stay an activist. When I said Hadja was here, you said you knew her and you knew her action, which shows us that there's a community of ideas. You know one another, you know your struggles. I think, Benoit, there will be many ways to unite these young people. Yesterday, the youth marches for climate started again. In Hong Kong as well, we have the milk tea movement, which gathers many young people from Southeast Asia. Obviously, we can't help but mention Iran as well, with everything that's happening there since the decease of this young woman, Masha Amini, for a lock of hair outside of the hijab. We know that the Iranis are rising in the streets. One last word from both of you. How do you connect to what's happening, and how do you stay hopeful? Obviously, the context, the state of play is very preoccupying for our world order. I think we can stay hopeful by believing in the fight against violence and for peace, for freedoms. That's the very essence of a mobilization that gives that allows everyone to speak out on social networks. And all these examples of mobilization that you've mentioned, yes, do go through digital tools. That's what we do with Ink for Peace, with social networks as well. Mr. Thelin was talking about the power we have, the power to act that we have on the internet. And I think we must use it. I think we can also stay hopeful by just mobilizing ourselves, organizing new initiatives, raising awareness. It's hugely important to reach this peace, and for that we must take into consideration every group of people in the world and consider their differences, to consider their characteristics, what they want. We very often lend an ear to dictators of thought trying to impose order. Hadja, for a last word. I would like to thank you for your invitation. It's a great honor. I had heard of the World Forum for Peace since 2019. It's a great pleasure to be here. To finish, I think that as a potential solution, we should place some trust in the youth. Why? Because we know what we want. We're not just all about having fun. We want to have a role to play in the development of our nations. We risk our own lives. I was locked up several times by religious leaders, by community leaders, because I was trying to save lives. So we must trust these people who put their lives on the line to make changes. Civil society, youth, women. So come and help us. It's good to listen to us, but it's even better to really involve us. That's the strongest message I can convey today in front of you. I do hope we will find a solution. Thank you. Your call has been heard. Hadja Idrissa Ba, Albin Ray, Benoit Thelin, thank you very much to all of you. Thank you for this exchange, which is giving us hope. I will ask Nicole Nisotto to join us center stage to conclude this morning's conference. One last word about Ink for Peace. You can consult this initiative on Instagram at ink.forpeace. Nicole. After this debate, we've talked about this thematics, down with the walls, these confinements producing wars. What struck you? First of all, I would like to say how much I regret being old. I'm very serious. Because there's so much to do, so much energy to inject in this world. So I noticed that the proportion of over 60-year-olds increases and the under 20-year-olds decreases. So we could maybe set up organizations gathering senior citizens and the youth from all across the world. I think we have experience, we have money, we could try. I don't know, it's an idea. That's my real comment. Regarding the rest of the day, I don't have a synthesis ready to made. There's one sentence from Chateaubriand coming to mind. It isn't necessary to love the world to see what's coming. Chateaubriand is not Norman, he's from Brittany, no one is perfect. But that's an extraordinary sentence. It's not necessary to love the world to see it coming. I think this day helped us to decipher the world to come. I don't like that world. I fear it. I have a 20-year-old daughter. I try to tell her that I was luckier than she was. I was born in a great period where we had no war, no unemployment, no worry for the war. We didn't even have AIDS in my time. So I must say I lived through a very happy time, and it won't be her case, even though she does live in privileged circumstances. So I think this forum is extraordinary. Both of you are formidable, because this is one of the places where we can try and see what's coming and find solutions for a better world. I love animals. 2 weeks ago, I was at the Beauval Zoo. I have a soft spot as a mother for animals, and I had never taken my daughter there, so it was high time we went with her. So I saw these animals, and it made me think that we shouldn't play the ostrich in this world, but we should be a surrogate. It's an extraordinary animal living in society, giving a specific role to one member of the pack. There's always one surrogate who acts as a meerkat, rather. So one meerkat from the pack has the role of a spotter. I think that's what we should do in this forum. Use the strategy of the meerkat to have spotters, people aware of what's happening and not be confused by the politically correct and the good conscience. Thank you. We had the hummingbird with the product Imagine. Now we have the meerkat with your analogy. Thank you. We will thank our guests today. Let's thank our donors. This World Forum for Peace would be impossible without the numerous donors assisting us, for most of them since the beginning. The forum carries on in the afternoon until tonight with numerous debates, animations, exhibitions, and Normandy for Peace platform, where we will find you there at 2 p.m. with Anne-Laure Bannon. There will also be a sculpture unveiled. So let's be spotters, let's be on the lookout like a meerkat with this forum, and let's try and find pathways for peace and reconciliation within us. There's no future without them. Thank you very much.